My name is Bella. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've been the kind of woman people describe as steady. Not brilliant, not threatening, not disruptive, just steady. I work in corporate compliance for a mid-sized investment firm in Chicago. On paper, that sounds authoritative. In reality, it often means sitting quietly in meetings while louder people decide what kind of risks they're willing to take, and then asking careful questions no one really wants to answer. I've always had a calm voice. Even as a child, teachers would comment on it. Bella doesn't get emotional, they'd say, like it was both a compliment and a limitation. In the workplace, that calm translated into something else. People assumed I wouldn't push too hard, that I'd document things, sure, but that I wouldn't disrupt anyone's comfort, especially not the comfort of powerful men. The story I'm about to tell you isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontations or explosive scandals. It's about something quieter. It's about what happens when loyalty inside a company quietly outweighs policy, when family ties bend rules, and when someone like me, someone underestimated, decides not to argue, but to document. They cut my bonus to 0 after I exposed the CEO's nephew for insider trading. That's the headline version. It sounds sharp, almost cinematic, but the truth unfolded slowly. At first, it was just small irregularities in trade timing, a pattern, a coincidence that didn't feel like a coincidence. Then it became a name, a relationship, a conversation behind closed doors that I wasn't invited to. When I brought it forward, I believed the company would follow its own rules. Instead, they followed blood. My bonus disappeared that year. Officially, it was due to budget recalibration. Unofficially, I had made something inconvenient visible. And visibility has consequences. What happened next wasn't loud. There were no screaming matches in glass offices, no dramatic resignations on the spot. What followed was a long, deliberate shift in power, one that most people didn't notice until it was too late to undo. This story is about quiet dominance, about understanding systems better than the people who think they control them, about how silence, when chosen intentionally, becomes leverage. I won't paint myself as a hero. I made mistakes. I hesitated longer than I should have. I believed in corporate integrity longer than it deserved. But I stayed honest with myself first. And sometimes that's where power begins. Have you ever been in a room where everyone knew something was wrong, but only one person was willing to put it in writing? To them, I was predictable. That's the word I've come to understand. Not kind, not competent. Predictable. I was the woman who arrived 10 minutes early to every compliance meeting with printed agendas already tabbed. The one who highlighted policy language instead of raising her voice. The one who sent follow-up emails, summarizing discussions in bullet points so clean they almost felt harmless. In a firm built on ambition and aggressive deal-making, I was in infrastructure. Necessary, but rarely celebrated. The traders called me our seatbelt. One of them once said it jokingly during a holiday party, a whiskey glass dangling loosely from his hand. Bella keeps us from flying through the windshield. Everyone laughed, including me, because a seatbelt isn't the engine. It isn't the steering wheel. It doesn't decide the direction. It only exists in case something goes wrong. I told myself that was fine. In meetings, I spoke carefully. I never interrupted. When senior executives debated strategy, I waited until the end, then asked quiet, precise questions. Just to clarify, was that pre-cleared under Section 4.2? Can we document the conflict review for that allocation? There would be a pause, a subtle tightening in someone's jaw, then a quick reassurance. Of course, Bella, we'll handle it. Handle it. Most of the time they did, at least enough to keep everything technically defensible. The CEO, Richard Halston, liked to describe the company as a family. He said it at quarterly town halls, his voice warm and paternal. We look out for each other here. It sounded comforting, until you understood what it meant. Families protect their own. I wasn't family. I was a staff member. Even when my performance reviews came back excellent, exceptional attention to detail, trusted advisor, critical to risk mitigation, there was always a ceiling implied in the compliments. I was respected, but not influential. Trusted, but not powerful. I remember once sitting at the long mahogany conference table during a strategy retreat. The partners were discussing expansion into a volatile emerging market. The numbers were aggressive. The compliance implications were complex. I presented a short risk brief. 10 minutes. Clear, structured, unemotional. When I finished, there was silence. Then Richard smiled. That's why we keep you around, Bella. Keep you around. Not invite you in. Not bring you forward. Keep you around. It wasn't cruel. That's what makes these dynamics so subtle. No one shouted at me. No one belittled me publicly. My salary was competitive. My office had a window. But I understood something quietly. I was valuable as long as I was contained. As long as my diligence didn't inconvenience anyone too deeply. I think many women in structured environments understand this role. You become the steady one. The ethical one, the one who cleans up language and ensures documentation, is tight. You are praised for your reliability, but rarely included in power. I told myself that power wasn't my goal. Stability was. Professionalism was. Doing the job well was. And for a long time, that was enough. Until the day I noticed a pattern in the trade logs that didn't match the narrative in the room. It started small. A date, a timing window, a name that appeared more often than it statistically should have. A name that happened to share the CEO's last name. At first, I assumed coincidence, because that's what someone in my role is expected to assume. Have you ever realized that the way people describe you quietly defines the limits they believe you'll accept? The first time I saw the trades, I didn't think insider trading. I thought timing anomaly. In compliance, language matters. You don't leap to accusations. You observe patterns. You isolate variables. You check the obvious explanations before you allow your mind to move toward the uncomfortable ones. The trades were clustered around earnings announcements, positioned just hours before public releases. The returns were unusually consistent, not dramatic enough to scream fraud, just precise enough to feel informed. The account holder was Daniel Halston, 26 years old, junior analyst, recently transferred into the firm's private investment division. Also, Richard Halston's nephew. That detail sat in the back of my mind like a quiet echo. Nepotism isn't illegal. Family working together isn't a crime. I reminded myself of that as I cross-referenced trade timestamps against restricted list updates. Everything appeared technically compliant. Pre-clearance forms were filed. Approvals were granted. Approved by whom? I traced the authorization trail. The approvals came from Marcus, head of trading, Richard's college roommate of 30 years. Still, none of that proved wrongdoing. It only suggested proximity, and proximity isn't evidence. So I did what I always did. I documented it. In my black leather notebook, I wrote the dates, the asset names, and the delta between entry and announcement. I didn't label it suspicious. I labeled it review, pattern, consistency. Then I scheduled a quiet meeting with Marcus. Not an escalation, a clarification. He greeted me with his usual easy smile, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, as he'd just stepped out of something important. "What's up, Bella?" I kept my tone neutral. "I'm reviewing Q2 trade timing across divisions. Daniel's account shows concentrated positions ahead of earnings. I just want to confirm information barriers were fully maintained." There was a pause, just a fraction of a second longer than normal. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Daniel's sharp. He does his own research." "I'm sure," I said. "This is just procedural confirmation." He nodded, but his expression shifted. Not defensive, just guarded. "We're family here," he added casually. "Richard trusts him. I trust him." I smiled politely. Trust and documentation aren't mutually exclusive. He laughed at that, a little too loudly. "We'll make sure the paperwork's airtight." When I left his office, I felt something small shift. Not outside me, inside. It wasn't the trades themselves. It was the way the conversation had subtly reframed the issue, from process to loyalty. I filed an internal memo recommending enhanced monitoring for accounts with executive affiliations. I kept the language broad, non-accusatory. The memo was returned to me 2 days later with a short comment from Richard's office. "Appreciate the diligence. Not necessary at this time." Not necessary. That was the first cut. No confrontation, no reprimand, just a quiet dismissal disguised as gratitude. At the next leadership meeting, my usual compliance segment was shortened. "We're tight on time," Richard said smoothly. "Let's move to strategic initiatives." No one objected. I sat back down, hands folded over my notebook. From the outside, nothing had changed. My title was the same. My responsibilities are unchanged. No one criticized my work, but something intangible had been adjusted. I had stepped slightly beyond my assigned perimeter, and the perimeter had gently pushed back. Later that week, during lunch in the break room, I overheard 2 analysts talking. "Compliance is getting intense lately," one said. The other shrugged. "Bella's thorough. That's her thing." Her thing. As if integrity were a personality quirk. I realized then that most people weren't ignoring the irregularities. They were choosing comfort. Because questioning Daniel didn't just question him, it questioned Richard. It questioned the structure that kept everyone secure. And security, in environments like that, is more valuable than fairness. I could have let it go. Many people would have. The memo had been dismissed. The trades were technically approved. No alarms, no violations on record. Just a pattern that didn't feel clean. I remember standing by the window in my office that evening, watching the city lights turn on one by one. I asked myself a simple question. Was I trying to protect the company? Or was I about to test how much the company was willing to protect itself? The answer didn't come immediately, but I didn't close the file. After that memo came back stamped with "not necessary," nothing dramatic happened. Which is exactly how normalization begins. No one called me into an office to warn me off. No one said stop digging. Instead, the air shifted in ways subtle enough to deny. My calendar invites became optional. Strategy meetings I used to attend automatically now arrive without my name on them. When I asked my assistant about it, she blinked at her screen and said, "Oh, I assumed they'd loop you in separately." They didn't. When I requested updated access logs from IT, something I'd done quarterly for years, I was told there would be a temporary delay due to resource prioritization. Temporary became indefinite. Still, my performance reviews remained glowing. Bella is an essential safeguard for the firm. The irony of that sentence still sits with me. Essential, but not central. In meetings, I noticed something else. When I raised routine compliance clarifications, the responses grew shorter. "We've got it covered. Already handled. Let's not overcomplicate this." Overcomplicate. That word stayed with me, as if policy were an inconvenience rather than a foundation. I began to sense the unspoken role forming around me. I was allowed to monitor, but not to challenge proximity. Allowed to question systems, but not relationships. The closer an issue moved toward executive territory, the more elastic the boundaries became. And I rationalized it. That's the part I don't romanticize. I told myself I was being paranoid, that corporate dynamics are always a little territorial, that it wasn't about Daniel, it was about optics, protecting leadership cohesion. I even adjusted my language in reports, softened phrasing, broadened categories, diluted specificity, not to hide anything, just to avoid triggering resistance. It's strange how quickly we adapt to subtle correction. One afternoon, during a cross-department review, Daniel presented a market analysis. He was confident, polished, well-spoken. When someone complimented his instincts for timing entries, he smiled modestly. I watched his face carefully. There was no arrogance there, no visible deceit. If he was acting on non-public information, he carried it calmly, almost innocently. That made it harder, because this wasn't a caricature of corruption. It was a young man operating inside a system that quietly insulated him. After the meeting, he stopped by my office. "Hey, Bella," he said casually. "I heard you've been reviewing my trades." His tone was light, curious. "Yes," I replied evenly. "Standard quarterly oversight." He nodded. "Uncle Richard mentioned you're thorough." Uncle Richard. There it was again, the reminder. Family first, firm second. "Thoroughness protects everyone," I said. He smiled politely. "Of course." The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. No tension, no hostility. But when he left, I felt something crystallize. I wasn't being openly disrespected. I was being repositioned, quietly, gradually, as someone who needed to be managed rather than heard. That's the dangerous phase in any professional environment, the phase where competence becomes inconvenient. Not because it's wrong, but because it's consistent. And consistency, applied evenly, doesn't bend for hierarchy. At home that night, I opened my notebook and reread my entries. Dates, times, price movements, approval signatures. Still no smoking gun, just probability tightening around a name. I considered closing the file, archiving it as an anomaly review. Moving on. After all, my career was stable, my salary is secure, my reputation is intact. Was I prepared to jeopardize that over something that wasn't yet provable? That question lingered longer than I expected, because here's the truth no one likes to admit. Systems rarely collapse from one obvious violation. They erode from tolerated exceptions. And I was watching an exception become normalized. The disrespect wasn't loud. It was procedural. It was polite. It was efficient. And because it wasn't cruel, it was easy to excuse. But I began to understand something uncomfortable. The moment you accept being strategically excluded, you teach people how to exclude you again. I hadn't been attacked. I had been quietly reassigned. And I was the only one who seemed to notice. Have you ever stayed silent not because you agreed, but because you weren't sure the cost of speaking would be survivable? It took me a few weeks to name it. I wasn't being pushed out. I was being positioned. There's a difference. Pushing someone out creates visible friction. Positioning someone keeps the structure intact while subtly redefining their influence. And once I saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. My role was simple. Be reliable. Be precise. Be invisible when it matters. I was the internal proof that the company took compliance seriously. My presence in presentations reassured investors. My reports created a paper trail of diligence. My calm demeanor signaled stability. But stability is only useful if it doesn't disrupt power. I began noticing how often my work was referenced without my voice attached to it. In one executive summary, Marcus quoted language directly from a risk memo I'd written. The phrasing was unmistakable, but my name wasn't on the slide. Compliance has reviewed and sees no material barrier concerns. Compliance, not Bella. At first, I told myself that anonymity was normal. Departments, not individuals, get credit in corporate structures. That's how professionalism works. But patterns matter. When strategic wins were celebrated, Daniel's name appeared. When aggressive positioning paid off, traders were applauded. When compliance reviews came back clean, the system was praised. When concerns were raised, they were attributed to process friction. I had become friction, useful friction, necessary friction, but friction nonetheless. One afternoon, I was asked to prepare documentation for an upcoming regulatory audit. The request came from Richard's office directly. "Make sure everything is airtight," his assistant said. "We want zero surprises." Zero surprises. The phrase felt layered. I spent 2 weeks reviewing every flagged transaction from the past year, including Daniel's. Each time I approached his file, I felt the weight of proximity. Not fear, not yet, just awareness. The evidence was still circumstantial, but the probability curve was tightening. The statistical consistency of his pre-announcement positions defied randomness. I drafted a supplemental monitoring recommendation again, this time framed around executive-affiliated accounts, broadly, without naming him. When I sent it upward, it returned with tracked changes. Language softened, thresholds raised, monitoring deferred. At the bottom, a short comment from Richard himself. "Appreciate your vigilance. Let's not create unnecessary internal distrust." Unnecessary distrust. That sentence was the clearest assignment yet. My role wasn't to protect fairness. It was to protect harmony. Harmony, in this case, meant preserving confidence in leadership, even if that confidence rested on selective blindness. I remember sitting in my office after reading that note. I didn't feel angry. Anger would have been easier. I felt clarified, because now the structure was visible. The firm didn't need me to uncover problems. It needed me to certify that none existed. There's a subtle psychological shift that happens when you realize your integrity is being used as insulation. Your reputation becomes a shield for decisions you don't fully control. That realization can break you, or it can sharpen you. At the next all-hands meeting, Richard stood on stage describing record quarterly performance. He praised innovation, agility, trust. "We're strong because we protect each other," he said. The applause was warm, genuine. I looked around the room and saw smart, capable people who believed in the firm. Many of them had mortgages, families, student loans. Stability is tied to this building. I understood why no one wanted to question the narrative. Family loyalty mattered more than company policy, until I made it public. But at that moment, it wasn't public. It was just me and a notebook, and a quiet awareness that I had been assigned a role that required selective silence. The question wasn't whether I could continue performing it. The question was whether I could respect myself, if I did. Have you ever realized the job you're praised for doing isn't the job you thought you were hired to do? The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday morning at 6:40 a.m., alone in my kitchen. I was standing barefoot on the cold tile floor, scrolling through pre-market alerts on my phone while my coffee brewed. Overnight, one of the firms we frequently partnered with had announced an unexpected acquisition. The stock had surged nearly 18% in pre-market trading. My stomach tightened before my mind fully caught up. I opened the internal trading dashboard remotely. Daniel had taken a substantial position in that company the afternoon before the announcement. Not a small exploratory trade. A confident one. The timestamp sat there quietly on my screen. 3:12 p.m., the day before public release. Technically, it was still possible he'd deduced the move through research. Analysts speculate all the time, but the frequency was becoming mathematically unreasonable. I didn't feel outrage. I felt alignment. All the scattered anomalies of the past months suddenly arranged themselves into a clean, undeniable pattern. Not emotionally undeniable, structurally undeniable. This wasn't instinct anymore. It was an accumulation. I closed my phone and stood still for a moment, listening to the soft drip of the coffee machine. The city outside my window was just beginning to wake up, gray light filtering between buildings, and I understood something clearly for the first time. If I ignored this, I would no longer be neutral. Silence would become participation. That was the shift. Up until that morning, I had framed my restraint as professionalism, as a caution, as ensuring I had enough evidence before escalating. But now the evidence had crossed my internal threshold. The company might choose loyalty over policy, but I didn't have to. When I arrived at the office, I didn't storm into anyone's office. I didn't draft accusations. I did something much quieter. I began building a timeline, not just of trades, of access, calendar overlaps, closed-door strategy meetings, earnings prep sessions, internal forecast drafts. I cross-referenced Daniel's trade activity with every instance of non-public information he could have reasonably encountered. I wasn't looking for a dramatic smoking gun. I was looking for statistical inevitability. The deeper I went, the calmer I became. There's a particular clarity that comes when emotion steps aside and principle takes over. My hands didn't shake. My breathing stayed steady. I wasn't imagining consequences yet. I was simply assembling truth. Late that afternoon, I received an email from finance regarding annual bonus projections. Mine had been adjusted downward significantly. No explanation attached, just a revised figure. I stared at the number for a long time. It wasn't zero, not yet, but it was a message. You are not aligned. I leaned back in my chair and let that realization settle. They had sensed my resistance. Maybe not consciously, maybe not maliciously, but systems react to friction. Bonuses are levers. Incentives signal belonging. For the first time, the risk wasn't theoretical. It was personal. And oddly, that made the decision easier. Because once pressure becomes visible, you can measure it. I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. Integrity is most expensive when it threatens proximity. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know whether I would win or lose. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not negotiate with numbers that were designed to buy my silence. The shift wasn't loud. No one else noticed it. But from that Tuesday forward, my silence was no longer hesitation. It was preparation. Have you ever reached a point where staying comfortable would cost you more than standing alone? After that morning, I stopped trying to be understood. That was the first visible difference. Before, when my recommendations were softened or dismissed, I would clarify. I would send follow-ups. I would gently restate policy language to ensure there was no confusion. Now I documented and said less. Silence, when it's reactive, looks like defeat. Silence, when it's intentional, becomes space. And space allows people to reveal themselves. In meetings, I no longer pushed when someone cut my compliance segment short. I simply noted the time, the agenda deviation. The decisions were made without review. When Daniel's trades passed through for routine sign-off, I processed them according to procedure. But I added an internal cross-reference log that only I maintained. A parallel record. Precise, dated, neutral in tone. I wasn't building a case yet. I was building continuity. The bonus reduction circulated quietly through finance, as those things always do. No one addressed it directly, but I felt the subtle shift in posture around me. Marcus stopped dropping by my office casually. Richard's assistant began scheduling my one-on-ones further apart. Performance feedback became generic. You're doing solid work, Bella. Solid. Not exceptional anymore. The message was clear. Alignment determines reward. And I understood something important during that period. They believed my silence meant recalibration, that I had understood the boundaries and adjusted accordingly. In a way, they were right. I had adjusted, just not in the direction they assumed. There's a psychological comfort that powerful people feel when resistance becomes quiet. They interpret it as acceptance, as maturity, as loyalty is restored. They don't consider that silence might be data collection. One afternoon, during a leadership check-in, Richard spoke about protecting internal cohesion during volatile quarters. His eyes met mine briefly when he said it. The room interpreted the statement as strategic wisdom. I interpreted it as a reminder. After the meeting, Daniel caught up to me in the hallway. No hard feelings about the extra monitoring talk earlier this year, right? He asked casually. His tone was light, almost friendly. Of course not, I replied evenly. Oversight is routine, he smiled. Good. I'd hate for you to think there's anything improper. There it was again. Improper. The word hung between us. I held his gaze for a second longer than usual. I prefer evidence to assumptions, I said calmly. Honestly, he nodded and walked away. That interaction told me more than any spreadsheet. People who are innocent rarely bring up accusations unprompted, but I didn't confront him. I didn't escalate, because timing matters more than truth alone. If I raised concerns prematurely, they would circle the wagons, frame me as overzealous, emotional, disruptive. If I waited, if I let the pattern grow undeniable, the conversation would shift from opinion to exposure. So I waited. At home, my life remained steady. I still went to the gym in the mornings, still called my mother on Sundays, still watered the small collection of plants in my apartment. From the outside, nothing dramatic was happening, but internally, something had hardened. Not into bitterness, to resolve. I began studying regulatory reporting pathways more deeply. Not because I didn't know them, but because I wanted to understand their thresholds, whistleblower protections, SEC submission protocols, external audit triggers. Knowledge reduces fear. And the more I understood the structure beyond our firm, the less dependent I felt on internal approval. The day my final bonus statement arrived, revised again, this time reduced to 0 under performance alignment review, I didn't react outwardly. No email, no protest, just a printed copy placed carefully into my notebook. They believed the financial lever would restore compliance. They misunderstood which kind of compliance I was built for. My silence no longer asked for permission. It was becoming strategic. Have you ever noticed how people grow comfortable the moment they think you've accepted less than you deserve? When my bonus was officially reduced to 0, the explanation was only 2 sentences long. Compensation adjustment reflects broader strategic alignment considerations. Strategic alignment. It was elegant, neutral language. No accusation, no disciplinary record, just a quiet financial correction. I signed the acknowledgement form without comment. That was what they saw. What they didn't see was what began the next morning. I stopped thinking like an employee protecting her position. I started thinking like a compliance officer protecting a record. There's a difference. An employee worries about relationships, optics, tone. An officer worries about documentation, thresholds, and jurisdiction. I began reconstructing 12 months of data, not just Daniel's trades, but communications architecture, I mapped information flow. Who had access to draft earnings decks? Who attended pre-release strategy calls? Who downloaded sensitive files and when? Our systems tracked more than most people realized. I pulled metadata logs under the routine quarterly audit authority. No red flags were triggered because technically I was operating within my role. That's the irony of underestimating someone in compliance. Access looks administrative. It rarely looks powerful. I built a spreadsheet that layered 3 columns side by side. Material non-public information access timestamps, Daniel's trade executions, market-moving public announcements. When you look at one column alone, it's defensible. When you look at all 3 together, patterns become narrative. The clustering was statistically aggressive. Not once or twice, repeatedly. High-confidence positions entered within hours, sometimes minutes, after internal forecast revisions. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. Instead, I asked a different question. If this were reviewed externally, would it withstand scrutiny? That's when I shifted from observation to preservation. I backed up documentation to encrypted personal storage, not proprietary data, but records of my own memos, escalation attempts, and response timestamps. My communications recommending monitoring, the tracked changes softening language, the not necessary at this time comments. Not to leak, to protect chronology. Powerful organizations rarely deny facts outright. They reinterpret the sequence. So I secured the sequence. Meanwhile, inside the firm, I became quieter than ever. No pointed questions in meetings. No additional memos. Just routine, impeccable performance. Marcus relaxed around me again. He resumed casual hallway conversations. Richard nodded warmly at quarterly reviews. The system believed the tension had passed. That's what happens when you remove visible resistance. People assume alignment. Daniel, in particular, seemed lighter. His trades grew bolder. Larger positions. Tighter timing windows. Confidence expands when oversight appears neutralized. One afternoon, while reviewing server logs, I noticed something subtle but critical. Daniel had accessed a draft acquisition summary file 23 minutes before placing a position in the target company. The file was restricted to executive review only. His access was tagged under Shared Credential Session. Shared Credential Session? That phrase doesn't exist accidentally. It means someone with proper access logged in from a different workstation. Someone with executive clearance. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. This was no longer a statistical suggestion. This was a structural breach. Still, I didn't move immediately, because intent matters in regulatory escalation. I needed to determine whether this was a system loophole or deliberate credential sharing. So I cross-referenced building access logs. That afternoon, Richard had been in a closed-door strategy meeting with Marcus. Daniel's badge had not been used to enter that floor. But the file was accessed. The timing aligned precisely with Daniel's trade. There are moments when clarity arrives without adrenaline. This was one of them. Family loyalty mattered more than company policy, until I made it public. And now I understood how deep that loyalty ran. Not just passive protection, active facilitation. I printed the access logs, placed them beside my timeline spreadsheet, added the cross-reference to my notebook with exact timestamps. Then I did something they truly never noticed. I scheduled a confidential consultation with an external securities attorney in my personal capacity. Not to sue, to understand exposure. Preparation isn't aggression, it's insulation. In our consultation, I laid out the data neutrally, removing names. The attorney listened quietly, then asked a simple question. Are you prepared for retaliation? I didn't answer immediately, because until that moment, retaliation had been theoretical. Reduced bonuses, social distancing, career stagnation, but external reporting changes the stakes. It transforms internal politics into regulatory risk. And regulatory risk threatens legacy. I left that office with clarity heavier than any fear I'd carried before. They thought my silence meant surrender. They never considered it might be a calibration. Have you ever prepared so thoroughly that the outcome stopped feeling emotional and started feeling inevitable? The word leverage is often misunderstood. People imagine it as something loud, something dramatic, a secret held like a weapon. But real leverage is quiet. It's the clarity that no one else realizes you possess. After my consultation with the securities attorney, I didn't feel empowered. I felt anchored. Because for the first time, I understood the full map of consequences. Not just for Daniel, but for the firm, for Richard, for Marcus, for the board. The attorney had been careful with her language. If the information you're describing is accurate, she said, this would likely meet the threshold for material non-public information misuse. And if credential sharing is involved, that introduces internal control failures. Internal control failures. That phrase carries weight in regulatory environments. It doesn't accuse one person. It questions governance, which means exposure doesn't stop at the nephew. It climbs. I went home that night and spread printed copies of my documentation across my dining table. Trade logs, access records, email threads, bonus reduction notice, my monitoring recommendations and their dismissals. It looked less like a scandal and more like a timeline of choices. Each document represented a moment where policy could have been prioritized over proximity. Each time, proximity won. Family loyalty mattered more than company policy until I made it public. But I hadn't made it public yet. This was still private, still reversible. I ran scenarios in my mind. Option 1, escalate internally again, this time presenting the access log discrepancy directly to Richard. Outcome, likely containment, possibly quiet removal of Daniel. My credibility was reframed as overreaching. My bonus is permanently frozen. Career stalled. Option 2, resign quietly, preserving my reputation but allowing the pattern to continue unchecked. Outcome, personal safety, ethical compromise. Option 3, submit documentation through formal external whistleblower channels. Outcome, investigation, subpoenas, media risk, retaliation is almost guaranteed. I sat there until midnight, staring at the pages. There was no thrill in it, no fantasy of public vindication, just arithmetic. If I acted externally, I would lose something tangible. If I stayed silent, I would lose something internal. And the internal loss felt heavier. The next morning, I tested something small. During a routine compliance check-in, I asked IT for clarification on and credential session protocols. The technician hesitated before answering. That's typically executive-level override access, he said. It's not supposed to be used for trading floor review. Is it logged automatically? I asked. Yes. Is it audited? He paused. Only if flagged. That told me everything. No one audits what they assume is safe. I didn't confront anyone with that information. I simply documented the confirmation. Later that week, Daniel executed another well-timed trade. This time, I didn't feel tension. I felt certainty, because the pattern had matured beyond interpretation. And here's the part no one talks about in these stories. Leverage doesn't feel powerful at first. It feels isolating. I couldn't discuss it with colleagues, couldn't hint at it in conversation, couldn't even allow my facial expression to shift during meetings. I had to sit in rooms with people whose futures might be altered by a decision they didn't know I was considering. That kind of knowledge requires discipline. I became almost unnervingly calm. At the next quarterly town hall, Richard stood on stage again, speaking about ethical leadership and protecting shareholder trust. The applause felt louder than usual. I watched him carefully, not with anger, with measurement. He believed the structure was stable. He believed loyalty had preserved cohesion. He didn't know that cohesion was already compromised. Not by me, by the choices that forced my hand. That evening, I drafted a structured summary of findings, purely factual, no adjectives. A timeline with attachments indexed and labeled. I saved it as a draft. Didn't send it. Not yet. Because leverage is only useful when timing aligns with impact. And I was waiting for the moment when silence would cost more than disclosure. Have you ever held the truth in your hands and realized the real power wasn't in exposing it, but in choosing exactly when to do so? The decision didn't come from anger. It came from arithmetic. 2 weeks after I finalized my documentation summary, the firm announced record quarterly profits. Bonuses were distributed early to reward strategic excellence. Mine remained at 0. No meeting, no feedback session, just a finalized compensation statement in the HR portal. I stared at it for a long time, not because of the money, but because of the confirmation. This wasn't caution anymore. It was a correction. I had been corrected for misalignment, and that clarified the equation. Up until then, I had allowed myself one illusion, that if I gathered enough evidence, internal integrity would eventually assert itself. But integrity doesn't self-activate inside systems that benefit from its suspension. It activates when exposure creates risk. That same afternoon, I received an internal email marked confidential. Daniel had been promoted to associate portfolio manager. The justification cited demonstrated instinct for market timing and strong performance consistency. I felt something close, not to rage, but to finality. Because promotions signal endorsement. Endorsement signals protection, and protection signals intention. This was no longer a passive oversight failure. This was structural validation. I opened my draft summary again, reread every line. Dates, access logs, email threads, monitoring recommendations dismissed, compensation reduction timeline. The narrative was clean, clinical, undeniable. Still, I hesitated. Not because I doubted the facts, because I understood the consequences. External reporting would trigger an investigation. The SEC doesn't move theatrically, but it moves methodically. Subpoenas would arrive. Internal communications would be reviewed. Access logs dissected. The firm's valuation could dip. Careers beyond Daniel's could fracture. And my name, if revealed, would not be welcomed inside those walls again. I closed my laptop and walked outside. Chicago in late autumn has a particular stillness. The air feels sharp enough to clear confusion. I walked along the river, hands in my coat pockets, watching reflections ripple against glass towers. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine both futures clearly. In the first, I stay. I I rebuild favor slowly. I accept the zero bonus as a lesson. I adjust the language further. I let the pattern continue, trusting that perhaps it will eventually correct itself. In that future, I keep stability, but I lose authority over my own moral code. In the second I report, I risk isolation. I risk reputation management campaigns framing me as overzealous. I risk financial uncertainty, but I keep alignment. And alignment, once lost, is difficult to recover. There's a myth that courage feels bold. In reality, it feels quiet and heavy. That evening, I returned home and opened the secure reporting portal the attorney had walked me through. The system required structured inputs, nature of violation, dates, individuals involved, supporting documentation. I filled in each section slowly. No adjectives, no emotional framing, just evidence. Before submitting, I paused, because submission is irreversible. Once external regulators are involved, containment disappears. Family loyalty mattered more than company policy, until I made it public. And this was the moment that would make it public beyond the firm's walls. I thought about my younger self, the girl who learned early that speaking up created conflict. I thought about the version of me who had laughed politely when called a seatbelt. Then I clicked submit. There was no dramatic confirmation, just a receipt number. Quiet, clinical, final. I closed my laptop and sat in silence. The world outside my apartment continued normally. Traffic lights changed. Neighbors moved through hallways. The city didn't tremble. But inside the firm, a clock had started ticking. They just didn't know it yet. Have you ever made a decision knowing it would cost you something and chosen it anyway? After I submitted the report, nothing happened. At least nothing visible. That's the part people misunderstand about regulatory processes. There's no immediate knock on the door, no dramatic phone calls. Investigations begin quietly, through data requests, cross-referenced filings, anomaly scans that don't announce themselves. And so I returned to work the next morning as if nothing had changed, because outwardly nothing had. Daniel walked past my office with his usual confident stride. Marcus joked about market volatility near the espresso machine. Richard's assistant circulated an invitation for the annual holiday gala. If there was tension in the air, it wasn't connected to me. Yet, I understood something crucial in that phase. Once you initiate external scrutiny, your behavior must become even more disciplined than before. No sudden detachment, no visible anxiety, no extra documentation that might signal anticipation. I did my job with clinical precision, signed off on routine compliance checks, participated in meetings, asked neutral, balanced questions. If anything, I became more agreeable. That's what they never expect. People anticipate resistance to look sharp, defensive, alert. They don't expect it to look calm. 2 weeks later, the first ripple appeared. IT sent a company-wide notice about enhanced audit log reviews to ensure system integrity. The email was framed as routine infrastructure maintenance, but I recognized the phrasing immediately. Enhanced audit log reviews. That language mirrors regulatory inquiry triggers. I didn't react. In the hallway, I overheard someone from trading mutter, probably just year-end housekeeping. Probably. 3 days after that, finance requested historical transaction reports dating back 18 months. Not from me, from the data warehouse team. That's when I knew the inquiry had advanced beyond preliminary. Regulators rarely start by asking questions directly. They start by pulling independent data streams. Still, no one looked at me differently. Not yet, because I hadn't changed. The bonus cut had already created the narrative they needed. Bella had been disappointed. Perhaps slightly rigid, but still professional. No one suspected escalation. Meanwhile, I took small protective steps. I scheduled a meeting with HR, not to accuse anyone, but to formally inquire about whistleblower protection policies under federal law. I framed it academically. I'm reviewing our compliance education materials, I said calmly. I want to ensure our internal reporting frameworks align with SEC protections. HR responded with polite reassurance. Of course, we have zero tolerance for retaliation. I nodded. Retaliation rarely announces itself as retaliation. It arrives as restructuring, as performance recalibration, as cultural misalignment. So I updated my resume. Not urgently. Strategically, I reconnected with a former colleague, now working at a different firm. Had coffee. Casual, informational. Not because I planned to leave immediately, but because leverage works best when you aren't trapped. At work, Daniel's trades continued. Bold, confident, unaware. There's a particular kind of blindness that comes from prolonged protection. When small consequences never arrive, risk feels imaginary. One afternoon, Marcus stopped by my office again. Glad things have felt smoother lately, he said casually. We're in a good rhythm. Smoother, I looked at him evenly. Rhythm is important. He smiled satisfied. He thought the friction had dissolved. What he didn't know was that the structure was already under examination. Externally, independently. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, because once a process begins outside your control, your only responsibility is consistency. 3 weeks after the IT notice, Richard canceled a planned investor luncheon without explanation. Rumors began circulating about unexpected regulatory inquiries affecting the sector. Sector, not us. Yet, the building still hummed with normalcy. Holiday decorations appeared in the lobby. Invitations to the gala were finalized. And through it all, I remained exactly who they believed I was. Predictable, reliable, quiet. That was the final layer of invisibility. They never considered that the calmest person in the room might have already changed the trajectory of everything. Have you ever moved so carefully that no one realized the ground beneath them was already shifting? The first visible crack didn't come with sirens. It came with a meeting invitation, mandatory executive review, attendance required. It was sent to senior leadership only. I wasn't included. That alone told me enough. When high-level meetings multiply without documentation requests flowing through compliance, it means conversations are happening faster than paper trails. By noon, the energy in the office had shifted. Conversations lowered in volume. Doors that usually stayed open were closed. Assistants moved with quiet urgency, carrying folders instead of tablets. Still, no one said the word investigation. They said clarification. They said routine inquiry. They said sector-wide review. Language is the first defense mechanism. Around 3 p.m., I received my own invitation. Compliance data reconciliation urgent. The email came from external counsel, not internal, external. I walked into the conference room calmly, carrying my notebook. 2 unfamiliar attorneys sat across from me. Polite, precise. "Thank you for joining, Ms. Marlowe," one of them said. "We're reviewing historical access logs and transaction timing protocols. We'd appreciate your insight into standard oversight procedures." Insight, not an accusation, I answered factually. Explained our monitoring thresholds, described the memo I had submitted months prior, recommending enhanced review of executive-affiliated accounts. They paused at that. "Can you provide documentation of that recommendation?" "Yes," I said evenly. "I have copies." I didn't need to feign surprise. They already had most of the data. They were measuring consistency. Over the next week, more requests surfaced. IT logs, email archives, authorization records. The firm framed it internally as cooperation. "We welcome transparency," Richard said in a brief, company-wide email. "We have nothing to hide. Nothing to hide." Yet the tension was undeniable now. Daniel stopped making bold trades. His activity dropped sharply. Marcus looked perpetually preoccupied. The casual hallway banter evaporated. One afternoon, I noticed Daniel sitting alone in a glass conference room, staring at his phone. For the first time, he didn't look confident. He looked uncertain. That's when consequences become real. Not when accusations are made, but when behavior changes. The market began reacting subtly as well. Analysts noticed the firm's reduced trading volume. A financial blog mentioned unconfirmed regulatory scrutiny. The stock price dipped 3%. Not catastrophic, but noticeable. Inside leadership meetings, voices grew sharper. I could hear fragments through closed doors. "We followed protocol. There's no proof of intent. How did this trigger external review?" That last question lingered. How? I never flinched when it floated through the hallway like static. Because retaliation begins with suspicion, and suspicion requires visible deviation. I had deviated in nothing. My performance metrics remain strong. My communication tone is unchanged. My attendance is perfect. Externally, I was indistinguishable from the version of me they'd always known. That's what insulated me. Then came the announcement. Daniel was placed on temporary administrative leave pending review. The email cited precautionary measures. Precautionary, no admission, no guilt. But administrative leave is not neutral. The trading floor felt hollow without his presence. People avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when I entered shared spaces. Not because they suspected me, but because uncertainty makes everyone guarded. A week later, Marcus resigned. Personal reasons, the internal memo stated. The timing was too precise to ignore. Still, no one approached me directly. No accusations, no confrontations. Just an atmosphere thick with recalculation. Family loyalty mattered more than company policy, until I made it public. Now loyalty was colliding with liability. And liability always wins eventually. I didn't feel victorious. I felt the weight of inevitability settling over a structure that had believed itself insulated. Have you ever watched the consequences of hidden decisions unfold and realized the people involved never expected accountability to arrive quietly? Panic, when it arrives in corporate spaces, doesn't look like chaos. It looks like meetings, endless meetings, calendars filled with alignment sessions, closed-door discussions stretched late into the evening, consultants brought in under vague titles like governance advisors. By the time Daniel's administrative leave was announced, it was already too late to contain what had begun. Because once regulators start pulling threads, they don't stop at the visible knot. They trace the weave. External counsel returned twice more. This time the questions sharpened. Who authorized shared credential access on October 14th? Why was the enhanced monitoring memo declined? Was compensation adjusted for any compliance personnel during this period? That last question carried weight. Compensation adjustments leave trails, and trails tell stories. I was asked to provide documentation of my bonus reduction and the formal reason given. I handed over the printed statement without commentary. 0. Performance alignment review. There was a long pause as one of the attorneys made a note. Retaliation doesn't have to be explicit to be relevant. Meanwhile, inside the firm, narratives began fracturing. Some executives framed Daniel's actions as isolated recklessness. Others blamed procedural misunderstandings. Richard maintained a composed front, but his tone shifted. Warmer in public emails, more measured in meetings. Regardless of outcome, he said during one town hall, we must reaffirm our commitment to transparency. Commitment. It would have cost less months ago. Now it costs reputation. The board convened an emergency session. News hadn't broken publicly yet, but financial journalists were circling. Questions about unusual trading patterns had surfaced on industry forums. The firm's stock dipped another 6%. Investors notice patterns faster than companies admit them. One afternoon, I was asked to sit in on a governance restructuring meeting. For the first time in months, my presence wasn't optional. They needed procedural credibility now. I listened as external advisors outlined recommendations. Independent oversight of executive-affiliated accounts. Separation of access credentials. Mandatory third-party audits. Each proposal echoed the memo I had written almost a year earlier. No one mentioned that, but I heard it. After the meeting, Richard asked me to stay behind. He looked older, not defeated, just recalibrated. We're implementing stronger controls, he said evenly. I want your input on the framework. It wasn't an apology. It was an acknowledgement of utility. I met his gaze calmly. Controls work best when applied consistently. A subtle tightening crossed his expression. He knew what that meant. The panic phase inside organizations is rarely about guilt. It's about control slipping beyond reach. They had believed loyalty would keep risk contained, but external review doesn't honor internal hierarchies. It measures facts. Daniel's leave became indefinite. Marcus's resignation was finalized. Internal emails reminded employees of whistleblower protections and ethical hotlines, tools that had existed all along but were rarely emphasized. Too late to fix it quietly. Too late to rewrite the timeline. Family loyalty had shielded proximity, but once policy entered the public sphere, loyalty couldn't override it. The firm announced an internal restructuring of leadership roles. Richard would remain CEO, but under board oversight pending investigation outcomes. Power wasn't gone, but it was no longer absolute. Through all of this, no one confronted me. No one accused me, but the air around me changed. Not colder, sharper. They were recalculating risk, and I was now part of the equation. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, because nothing I had documented was exaggerated. Nothing was fabricated. Everything unfolded along the lines the data had already drawn. Have you ever watched someone try to repair something that could have been prevented? If only they had listened when it was small. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no accusations, no slammed doors. Just a meeting invitation from Richard's assistant. Private discussion. 4:30 p.m. I walked into his office at exactly 4:29. The room looked the same as it always had. Floor-to-ceiling windows, muted city skyline behind him, framed awards lining the shelves. Stability curated into architecture. Richard gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Thank you for coming, Bella. His tone was controlled, not warm, not hostile. Measured. I sat, notebook resting calmly on my lap. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, external regulators have indicated that concerns were raised internally before escalation. He didn't phrase it as a question. He phrased it as a fact awaiting acknowledgement. I submitted monitoring recommendations. I replied evenly. They declined. He nodded slowly. You didn't raise further objections internally? I documented the responses, I said. Another pause. He leaned back in his chair, studying me. You could have come to me directly. There it was. Not anger. Disappointment framed as betrayal. I did, I said calmly. Through formal channels. His jaw tightened slightly. This could have been handled without external damage. Handled. I held his gaze without aggression. If policy had been applied consistently, there would have been nothing to escalate. The air between us shifted, not heated but clarified. He wasn't asking whether I had reported. He already knew. He was measuring my reasoning. You understand the consequences, he said quietly. People's careers, the firm's valuation. Yes, I replied. Hide. And you felt that was justified? I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was unsure, because words, in moments like this, define identity. I felt that ignoring it would compromise my role, I said. Compliance can't be conditional. Silence. The city hummed faintly beyond the glass. He looked tired for the first time since I'd known him. Family loyalty matters, he said, almost to himself. It does, I agreed. But so does fiduciary duty. That was the closest we came to confrontation. No shouting, no threats. Just two professionals sitting across from each other, acknowledging a fracture that had been building quietly for months. He exhaled slowly. "The board is implementing structural changes," he said. "Your department will have expanded authority." Authority, offered after exposure. I nodded once. "That will strengthen oversight." He studied me again. "You're very calm about all of this." I allowed the faintest hint of honesty into my voice. "I've had time to think." That was true. This hadn't been impulsive. It hadn't been reactive. It had been deliberate. He didn't apologize. I didn't ask him to, because apologies are emotional currency. Accountability is structural. As I stood to leave, he added, "I hope you understand. I never intended for your compensation adjustment to feel punitive." I paused at the door. "Intent and impact don't always align," I said quietly. Then I left. The hallway outside felt brighter somehow, or maybe clearer. There was no victory in that room, no humiliation, just acknowledgement that silence had not meant surrender. And those quiet people, when pushed far enough, don't explode. They decide. Have you ever had a confrontation where no one raised their voice, yet everything changed? A year later, the firm looks different. Governance committees have independent chairs now. Executive account monitoring is automated and audited externally. Shared credentials were eliminated entirely. Compensation reviews for compliance roles are overseen by the board. On paper, it's a stronger institution. In practice, it's quieter. Daniel never returned. The official findings cited policy violations related to misuse of material non-public information. No dramatic press conference, just a settlement notice and regulatory disclosure. Marcus moved into a consulting role outside the firm. Richard remains CEO, but not unexamined. Oversight changed him. Or perhaps it simply revealed the limits of loyalty in public markets. And me? I'm still here. That surprises people when they hear this story. They expect resignation, a triumphant exit, but quiet dominance isn't about leaving. It's about redefining presence. My role expanded formally, 6 months after the investigation concluded. Director of Compliance Oversight. The title came with authority I had effectively been exercising long before it was acknowledged. The difference now isn't power. It's clarity. I'm no longer perceived as friction. I'm perceived as a foundation, not because I demanded recognition, because the system learned what happens when compliance is sidelined. My bonus the following year wasn't just restored. It was recalibrated to reflect critical institutional integrity contributions. The phrasing made me smile privately. Integrity had always been critical. It just hadn't always been convenient. I don't walk the halls differently. I don't carry myself with visible triumph. If anything, I'm softer in conversation now, more patient. Because I understand something I didn't fully grasp before. Authority rooted in principle doesn't need volume. It needs consistency. The black leather notebook still sits on my desk. I still write in it. Not out of suspicion, but out of discipline. Documentation isn't distrust. It's memory. Sometimes new hires ask me about the audit year. They're curious, careful. I don't dramatize it. I tell them this. Policy protects everyone, especially when it's applied evenly. That's all. There's no bitterness in me, no desire to relive the tension, because the real transformation wasn't external. It was internal. I used to think stability meant keeping harmony at all costs. Now I understand stability comes from alignment, even when alignment disrupts comfort. I don't feel braver than I was. I feel clearer, and clarity changes how you occupy space. They used to describe me as predictable. Now they describe me as steady. The difference is subtle. Predictable people are expected to stay within lines drawn for them. Steady people draw their own. Have you ever looked back at a version of yourself and realized she was stronger than anyone, including her, gave her credit for? When people hear this story, they often ask me if it was worth it. If the stress, the isolation, the financial hit, the uncertainty was worth the outcome. I always pause before answering, because worth it depends on what you measure. If you measure comfort, then no. It would have been easier to stay quiet, to accept the zero bonus as corporate politics, to let family loyalty quietly outweigh policy, and tell myself it wasn't my responsibility to correct it. If you measure reputation inside a single building, it is risky. But if you measure alignment, if you measure whether you can sit alone at your kitchen table and respect your own reflection, then yes, it was worth it. This was never about humiliating anyone. It was never about revenge. I didn't celebrate Daniel's leave. I didn't take satisfaction in Marcus's resignation. Accountability isn't entertainment. It's structure. And structure protects more people in the long run than loyalty ever can. Family loyalty mattered more than company policy, until I made it public. That sentence sounds dramatic, but what it really means is simple. Rules only matter when they apply to everyone, especially when it's inconvenient, especially when it's personal. What I learned is this. Quiet people are often mistaken for compliant people, but there's a difference between being peaceful and being passive. Peaceful means you don't escalate unnecessarily. Passive means you accept misalignment to avoid discomfort. I was peaceful for a long time. Then I chose not to be passive. And the choice didn't require shouting, it didn't require threats. It required preparation, patience, and the willingness to accept consequences. If you're in a position where you've noticed something small, something that doesn't sit right, I won't tell you what to do. Every situation has its own cost, but I will ask you this. When loyalty and integrity pull in different directions, which one can you live with long term? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been in a situation where doing the right thing meant standing alone for a while?
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.